one of the reasons for the inspiration to put together this talk was a friend of mine who said, I'm thinking of taking the Bodhisattva vows. And I said, oh, really? And so I thought, now, he should know what a Bodhisattva does. And it is something that I think it's worth contemplating. And what I wish to do this evening is to talk with you about this ideal, the Bodhisattva ideal, and how it is understood today by the various traditions of Buddhism, and possibly its roots, how it was originally understood, possibly in the time of the Buddha. For those of you who are familiar with Buddhism, you know that there are many schools. Generally we say the Mahāyāna school and the Theravāda school. Sometimes they say Hinayana. Nobody likes Hinayana. Nobody likes to be called that anyway. Or sometimes they say the northern schools of Buddhism and the southern schools. Southern schools primarily in Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, parts of other countries. We call these the Theravāda tradition of Buddhism. And it prides itself as being possibly the closest to the original form of Buddhism that may have existed in the time of the Buddha. And of course, that was a long time ago. Today, according to the Thai calendar anyway, this year is the 2568th year since the passing of the Buddha. So that's quite a long time. And of course, many things happened during this long time. But it is important to at least appreciate that all of these different schools, traditions, teachings, scriptural documents must have some relation to this common root that there was a historical Buddha who lived in the Ganges Valley around 500 BC, and he did do something quite remarkable in that he was able to inspire such a large number of followers, and such a large number of those followers actually undertook a life that was very much stylized or specialized simply to arrive at an understanding of truth, which he called the Dharma. Now, that was a long time ago. It is thought that the Buddha traveled throughout the Ganges Valley, and he would have spoken in the language of the people. And of course, probably a number of different dialects. Nobody really knows what that dialect was or what that combination of dialects. But usually, Magadha was a very large kingdom at that time, and people probably spoke very similar dialects. The vernacular of what was spoken in those days, what we have are the Pāli scriptures. Now, Pāli is the term that's used, what it means is scriptural language, and it's used in the Theravāda tradition. So that what the Buddha spoke may have been something like this Pāli language. However, Pāli does not have a script, unlike Sanskrit, which was the classical Indian language, much like Latin was the classical, we say, European language, and it was very stylized, formal. Sanskrit is very formal. Pāli is like a dialect of that. It's a spoken language. It's not a written language. It's what the ordinary people would have been speaking. And so these two languages, if you wish, or forms of language, are what the scriptures of the Buddhist tradition are found in today. This is in the Mahāyāna school. Sanskrit is the dominant scriptural language. Of course, it's translated into Tibetan, Chinese, Japanese, and on, very many different languages. The Theravāda tradition retained this Pāli language for its text. So even though Pali doesn't have a script, it is written in the alphabet or script of whatever country it was passed to. So in Sri Lanka, it's in the Sinhalese script. In Thailand, it's in the Thai script. But the pronunciation and the words should be very similar, and the meaning should be very similar. Now, I say all this as a preamble just to emphasize that whatever school of Buddhism and whatever teachings of Buddhism, they did have this common source. And although we don't know exactly what these teachings of the Buddha, like with 100% certainty would be, we can have a high degree of confidence that the very essential teachings were the ones that were preserved earliest on in the history of Buddhism. In other words, during the time of the Buddha, shortly after the time of the Buddha, what were the teachings that were being passed on, either just verbally. It was an oral tradition to begin with, like all spiritual traditions in India. Later it became written instructions. So what were these earliest Buddhist texts, the earliest Buddhist teachings? What did they contain? And I would say that they would be the closest that we can get to what the Buddha said and what he did. And so when I look at these earliest Buddhist scriptures, you notice that there are some very fundamental, essential teachings. And if it's an important teaching, it is not mentioned just once. You don't find it as an isolated paragraph or sentence or word in this collection. It is repeated often because that's the nature of a teacher. If he has a really important message with a core teaching, he's not just going to mention it once when he's at the Theosophical Society giving his talk to this group and then forget about it. He's going to say the same thing wherever he goes. And this is definitely the case with the teachers that I've known during my time in Thailand and other countries. There is a core essence to the teaching that's the greatest importance, and that's what's emphasized. Of course, there are peripheral teachings, but there are some fundamental, essential teachings, and all the Buddhist traditions will have these essential core teachings, all of them. And it would be hard to imagine how it could be a Buddhist tradition if it didn't have those. But, as often happens with the passage of time, and it doesn't take long for things to, diversify. And certainly, even during the time of the Buddha, there would have been monks living in various parts of the Ganges Valley, and they would have slightly different understandings. And it's recorded in those early Buddhist scriptures where there was some wrong views expressed by some disciples that had to be corrected by the Buddha. So even during the time of the Buddha, and there were disagreements about the teachings, about the discipline. But the Buddha was the go-to person to resolve those things. And so he was the authority. Once he passed away, that authority was gone. And so after 40 years of teaching, he did pass away. But the community of monks that he had established by that time being quite large and thriving, understood the need to have some common foundation of teachings that they would revere and maintain through oral transmission and eventually through written transmission. 2 months after the Buddha passed away, it is said that a congregation of 500 of these senior monks gathered together to recite what they call the Dhamma Vinaya. The Dhamma, the teaching, and the rules of discipline for the monastic order. This became the early Buddhist texts. Over time, things people who were not attending that first congregation said, well, I've got teachings that I heard the Buddha say. Why don't you include these? And so in the next 100 years, there was a second congregation, the Great Council, and they once again expanded. They added some extra teachings. Now, some of these were actual teachings of the Buddha. Some of them were extrapolations. And so, the basket of discourses got bigger. And about 300 years after the Buddha, there was another great congregation, and the basket got bigger again. And whereas originally there were only two baskets, one of the Dharma and one of the Vinaya, then they added the Abhidharma, which is the higher Dharma, which was extrapolated and added. This being said, you can see how the teachings, though they are still classified as scriptural teachings, not all scriptures are created equal. And of course, with the passage of time and these, by 300 years after the Buddha, there were 18 schools of Buddhism in northern India. And they all, taught slightly different things, and they developed their own scriptures and they added to them. And today you've got so many Buddhist scriptures, you could probably spend a whole lifetime trying to read them all, let alone understand them. That's why I am a Theravāda Buddhist, because I am too lazy to read and understand so much stuff, because I truly believe that the Buddha had a very important message that he realized and wanted to share. And it did not require a PhD in Buddhist studies to understand this, but it requires a lifetime of commitment to realize it, to actually reach its heart. The intellectual aspect it's not that taxing actually. So, what does a bodhisattva do? Why this is interesting to me is the word bodhisattva. Bodhisattva has become, very common usage these days, and most of us think of a bodhisattva as a wonderful person. As somebody who's really got high ideals to help humanity. And of course, now we've got bodhisattva of compassion, bodhisattva of wisdom, bodhisattva of this, and bodhisattva of that. And people do take these bodhisattva vows. Now, this is a term that's used primarily in the Mahāyāna tradition, and bodhisattva is a Sanskrit word, which is mainly used in Mahāyāna tradition. Its roots are found in those early Buddhist scriptures. In other words, the very earliest of the scriptures. The term used there is Bodhisatta. And as you can see, Sanskrit and Pāli, the Pāli is always a simplification of fewer letters because it's how people speak. And so Dharma becomes Dhamma, Karma becomes Kamma. And so Bodhisattva is Bodhisatta. So there was, in the time of the Buddha, this term used. The Buddha used it himself, and he defined quite specifically, or in the context of how he used it, we know what it meant to him and to the people around him. Though these are similar words and share the same roots, they are understood quite differently these days. So, in the Mahāyāna Buddhism, a bodhisattva is a person who has achieved or is striving towards bodhi, which is awakening enlightenment, but forgoes or delays personal nirvana, enlightenment, in order to compassionately help other individuals attain liberation. So that is the general Mahāyāna tradition, that's my understanding of a bodhisattva. Someone who is very highly spiritually evolved, but intentionally holds back from attaining nirvana, which is full enlightenment. Although some people say bodhisattvas are enlightened. That is not quite how it is understood in Theravāda. So they are highly evolved, spiritually evolved. They do not go all the way because they want to stay around and help other people. And this is a wonderful ideal, isn't it? You can see why that's popular, because it's an ideal that is highly praised and highly regarded. Something of self-sacrifice, which is perfectly in keeping with the Buddhist teachings. But one of the aspects of this Bodhisattva vow that I find a little bit difficult sometimes is when the vow includes things that they will not attain enlightenment until they have saved all living beings. That one is just a bridge too far. Okay? But so this is the Bodhisattva. Now, in early Buddhist schools, as well as in modern Theravāda Buddhism, the Bodhisatta refers to someone who has made a resolution to become a Buddha and has also received a confirmation or prediction from a living Buddha that this will come to pass. In Theravāda Buddhism, the Bodhisattva is mainly seen as an exceptional and very rare individual. Only a few select individuals are ultimately able to become Bodhisattas, because the Bodhisatta's path is to become a Buddha. So Maitreya is the current Bodhisatta who's going to become the next Buddha. And the Buddha arises, supposedly, when the dispensation, the teaching, the Dharma is lost and no longer known to humanity. And the Bodhisattva arises and once again rediscovers the path and points out the path. Now, this in the early Buddhist text, these are the words supposedly spoken by the Buddha, the historical Buddha, in this Majjhima Nikaya discourse. And the Majjhima Nikaya is one of the early texts. It's got high credentials. I myself, before my self-awakening, when I was still just an unawakened Bodhisatta, saw as it had come to be with right discernment that sensuality is of much suffering, much despair, and greater drawbacks. Now, the important part here is that the Buddha, Gautama, Siddhartha Gautama, is saying, before my enlightenment, when I was a Bodhisatta, so meaning when I was striving to become a Buddha, he had this bit of insight. But he was not a Buddha, he was a Bodhisatta, striving to become a Buddha. And that is the definition of a Bodhisatta in the Theravāda tradition. There's another quote. Monks, before I attained supreme enlightenment, while I was still a Bodhisatta, the thought occurred to me, this world, alas, has fallen into sore distress. There is being born, growing old, dying, passing over, and being reborn. But from all this suffering, from decay and death, no way of release is apparent. Surely there must be some way of release discoverable from this suffering, this decay and death. So this was in another early text, still Bodhisatta, unenlightened, and he sees, there's a lot of suffering around. He sees the limitation of samsara, the realm of birth and death, the realm of impermanence, and surely there must be an escape from this. And that was the impetus for his striving, for his seeking for liberation. So this is how a Bodhisatta is understood in the Theravāda tradition. What the Buddha does, what the Bodhisatta does, is when the path is no longer known, he discovers the path to the deathless, if you wish, to the truth. And then he reveals the path to those who follow him. And that's the big difference. He's the discoverer of the path. We don't need a lot of discoverers. If once Australia has been discovered, other people can go there. You don't, it's like, you just need, not everybody needs to be a discoverer, but a lot of people need to go to a place, okay? So the idea of the Bodhisattva is quite special. Then in the Buddha, in another discourse, talks about 6 other Buddhas. You must appreciate that in Buddhism there is no such thing as a beginning. There is no beginning, and there is no end in samsara. Samsara is a realm of arising and passing. No beginning can be perceived, are the words of the Buddha. Now what does that mean? Is that you can't talk about a beginning. As soon as you posit a beginning, you set up a problem. So if samsara, the realm of coming and going, birth and death, the cyclical evolution and convolutions of the world systems, expansions and contractions, is, almost, you could say, timeless. So obviously there have been many other Buddhas in the past. And the Buddha actually, in this discourse, he mentions 6 previous Buddhas. And I'm not going to read them all out to you, but that's the ones that were found in this early scripture. And the important thing is that 91 eons ago, a kalpa or a kappa is a world system expansion and contraction. It's a very long time. So it's unimaginable, the length of time. But so the Buddha talked about these past Buddhas. There have been many Buddhas in the past. And all of these Buddhas, before they became Buddhas, were Bodhisattas. He also, it seems to me that in the Theravāda tradition, they made the Buddha, it's like they made this, the life of the Buddha is so exaggerated. Not in the early Buddhist text, but as I said, as these were expanded and added to, especially this particular one, the Buddha Vamsa, it's known as the Chronicle of the Buddhas. Yeah, I like that word, hagiographical. I had to look it up. I had no idea what it meant. I don't know whether you do. You're probably better educated than I am. But it's this elaborate, usually of a religious teacher, idealization and making into an idol and exaggeration. And so in these texts we find these really convoluted stories about the Buddha's past, these past lives. They've got these Jataka stories. These are like 500 past life stories of the Buddha. And, it's like quite really elaborate, right? Really, it's mythology. And that's why it's a later text. It's not in one of the earlier texts. The Sutta in the Khuddaka Nikaya, they just added all sorts of things there, all the leftovers in that collection. So these are not to be taken, I don't put much weight in them, but it gives you some idea of how early Buddhists or those thought of the Buddha. So even though the Buddha himself in the early scriptures mentions 6, in this expanded and extended mythology, they go back to 24 Buddhas until Dipankara Buddha was the 24th past Buddha in this list. And he was the Buddha who gave the prediction of future Buddhahood to the hermit Sumedha, who would become Gautama Buddha in a future life. So they trace this back. In the time of Dipankara Buddha, there was this tremendously gifted hermit, Sumedha, and he heard that the Buddha Dipankara was visiting the lowlands, and he was inspired. Buddha, oh, I want to meet him. And so Sumedha went down to the lowlands from his cave to meet Dipankara Buddha, and he was awestruck. He thought, wow, what a great being. I also want to become a Buddha, just like Dipankara. And he made this resolution. And it says there that actually, in order to prevent Dipankara's feet from getting soiled in the mud, he laid himself down so that he could walk over him. Sumedha laid himself down. And Dipankara, the Buddha, was able to have psychic powers. He realized this great devotion and great aspiration of Sumedha, that he said, may I be able to one day attain enlightenment like this Buddha and help the countless living beings by teaching the Dharma. Dipankara Buddha read the mind of ascetic Sumedha and announced to those there, this ascetic will one day become enlightened as a Samma Sambuddha named Gautama Buddha. So that's, really a special event, but that's not the way that it is. That's the Theravāda understanding of Bodhisatta and the relationship to Buddhahood. How does the Bodhisatta become a Buddha, and how does a Bodhisattva practice in order to fulfill one's aspirations? Now, though they may mean slightly different things, there are, certain practices that are common to both in terms of what they undertake in order to achieve the aspiration. Paramita or parami, these are interchangeable. The term paramita or parami refers to core Buddhist concepts of perfections or transcendental virtues. And these are the qualities that are cultivated by a bodhisattva or a bodhisatta, an individual aspiring to progress towards final enlightenment and achieve Buddhahood. Now, what I want to say about these paramitas and parami is that in the early Buddhist texts, you don't find this list as a separate list anywhere. These were collected and put together as lists. And on the other hand, every one of these virtues, every one of these qualities are found in the core Buddhist teachings over and over again. But they're just part of the training, virtues that should be cultivated, never referred to as paramitas or paramis. But, these are obviously later formulation. This list of paramitas and paramitas are later formulations. And the reason we know this is because different Buddhist schools have different numbers of paramitas, quite different lists. So in the Mahāyāna tradition, the most common one are the 6 paramitas: generosity, ethical conduct, patience, diligence, meditation, and wisdom. That's a good list. That's a good list. And all of these: generosity, ethical conduct, patience, diligence, meditation, wisdom, these are found in all the core teachings of the Buddha. They're common. You find the Buddha talking about these qualities over and over again. It's just that they've been grouped here as a special group called paramitas for the Bodhisattva to develop. Now, I actually like this list. I quite like it. And I think this list may predate the Theravāda list of paramitas, which were also collected. So the paramitas, in the Theravāda tradition, not to be outdone, they came up with 10 paramitas. And that's why I think it was a later addition, because obviously Mahāyāna, that sect, has got 6 paramitas. We're going to have 10, so take that. So these are the 10 paramitas in the Theravāda tradition that the Bodhisatta is perfecting lifetime after lifetime. Dana, or giving, it's the same as generosity. Sila, virtue, is the same. Nekama is extra, renunciation. It didn't have it on the other ones. Panya, wisdom, is the same. It's on both lists. Virya, energy, diligence, vigor, effort, was not on that list. It's here. Khanti, patience, tolerance, forbearance, endurance, is on both lists. Satya, truthfulness, was not on that list. It's on this list. Adhitthana, determination, resolution, is on this list. Metta, goodwill, friendliness, kindness, is on this list. Upekkha is on this list. It's not exactly the same as the other one at all. But these qualities are also found in the teachings of the Buddha over and over again, praised as great virtues to be developed by everybody. And there are many occasions when every one of these comes up in the teaching, but not as a full list until later on, until this whole ideal of the Bodhisattvas and Bodhisattvas came about. So that is to say that these are later developments, but they are in keeping with very essential core teachings of Buddhism. It's just that they now formalize as a particular vehicle of practice to be cultivated by the Bodhisattva or by the Bodhisatta. And in the reason I prefer, actually, myself, the reason I prefer the 6 paramitas is because it's got this one thing here, meditation, or jhana in Pali and dhyana in Sanskrit. And in the 10 paramitas, it's not there, which is really, to me, strange, because it's such a core aspect of the path. But it's got all these extra ones, so it's a fair trade. But you'll find all of these everywhere. So if one says, well, what is a bodhisattva supposed to do? I guess you're supposed to be cultivating all of these, either the 6 or the 10. If you're a theosophist, you'll cultivate the 7 of that Madame Blavatsky wrote about. I don't know, she just added one. And I think there are some other schools of Buddhism that actually have different combinations. But they're all good. So what I'm going to do briefly is to go over these 10 that are taught in the Theravāda tradition. And because, as I said, of the Theravāda tradition, I choose to do the 10 rather than the 6 for you. Quickly, I'm not going to dwell on them a lot. Dana is generally translated as generosity, giving, selflessness. And it is really fundamental, I think, to all spiritual paths. It is fundamental to all spiritual practice, the ability to take the attention away from me and mine and my self-interest, and just for me and my gratification, my preservation. That is completely devoid of any spiritual inclination. That is the instinctual level of the human and of the animal. It is purely instinctual. Now, dana means the ability to see and open the mind to the others and to the other, and recognize that you can share. You know, as you think about how difficult it is for children to learn that, because, you know, as very small children, it's quite hard for them to share things, I think. You know, hold on, it's mine. But then, you know, we can grow beyond that. You know, we grow beyond this mine. So dana is a very important quality or virtue to cultivate and strengthen in order to make progress on the spiritual life. And I like this sort of guidance of how to do it. Is a person of integrity gives a gift with a sense of conviction, attentively, in season, with an empathetic heart, and without adversely affecting oneself or others. I like that. In other words, it's a well-reasoned, well-thought-out, appropriate, timely, considerate, kindly act of sharing without hurting yourself or others. Now, sometimes people are very generous, but they're kind of generous in a stupid way, and that's not very good. I think we should be generous like that. What that says there. Now, even in the Buddhist texts, one of the Jataka stories that speaks about the Bodhisatta cultivating this, the stories of the hungry tigress. So supposedly I can't quite remember whether he was a noble person, a noble young man or a prince, and he's on this, excursion in the forests and hills with a retinue of followers, and he sees this hungry tigress that had just given birth, and the tigress is weak and dying, and so he wants to help this tigress, and this is the Jataka story. So in one of them it says that while his fellows went seeking for food to give to the tigress, he said, "There's no time, I have to help now." And in one of the stories he cuts his throat and lays down in front of the tiger so the tiger could feed. In another one it says that he jumped off the cliff and in front of the tiger so the tiger could feed on him. There must be easier and better ways than that to help the tiger. Surely it doesn't require quite that amount of, just go get some food. So, it's extreme. That being able to be generous and giving in a thoughtful, kind, compassionate way, but it's also reasonable. What's in season, at the right time, the right place, and considering your standing, your ability. Don't give your last $100 to the beggar and then you can't get on a tram or a bus to go home. And you have to hitchhike, and then maybe you'll get into trouble. Who knows what will happen to you? I don't want to even think about it. Sila is virtue. And this is common, again, these are so, Bodhisattva doesn't do anything magical, really. It's really just common sense, isn't it? You want to be on a spiritual path, you're generous. You live a virtuous life. That's not high tech. There is the case where a noble disciple, abandoning taking of life, abstains from taking life. Abandoning taking what is not given, abstains from taking what is not given. Abandoning illicit sex, abstains from it. Abandoning lying, abstains from it. And abandoning the use of intoxicants and drugs that lead to heedlessness. And he abstains from those things. In doing so, he gives freedom from danger, freedom from animosity, freedom from oppression to limitless numbers of beings. Sila is another one of the core spiritual virtues found over and over again in the teachings of the Buddha. And I would probably say, if a spiritual tradition doesn't have it as a core teaching that's explicit as to what it means, refraining from hurting, killing, stealing, lying, abusing, I think there's something wrong with the spiritual teaching. Nekkhamma is a slightly higher level, if you wish. It's renunciation. And really it's not so much the degree of renunciation. It's not that everybody has to become a naked ascetic. we don't have any naked ascetics except in the naked beaches where people go to swim. But in India, they had naked ascetics. They still do. But it's not necessarily the degree at which you give things up. It's the intention, more or less. What are your values? What are our values? So nekkhamma, a Pali word generally translated as renunciation, conveying a departure from the overriding concern for the worldly life, values and pleasures. That's no longer your main focus in life. It's not the biggest priority in life, which is a radical shift from the normal materialistic view. Intentionally orienting oneself to the pleasure of renunciation with the goal of achieving freedom from lust, craving, and desires. And I like this pleasure of renunciation. Renunciation is often, we think of it as kind of a self-sacrifice, and it's hard. We don't want to do it. We'll do it during Lent, maybe a little bit, but not all the time. But if we think of renunciation as unburdening ourselves, uncluttering ourselves, in the Buddhist tradition, when the going forth from the home life to the life of the monastic, the homeless life, it's often rendered as abandoning the cluttered life for the simplicity of the spiritual life that's focused on that one thing. So nekkhamma is also, just think of it as ways of living our lives so we're not so burdened, where our lives are not so cluttered, we're not so distracted that we've got no time to be in tune with the present, to have time to introspect, have time to meditate, have time to aspire to higher ideals. So it is a reorienting of our values. Panya is, in both lists, it's wisdom. And there's wisdom, understanding, intelligence, discernment, many different words. What actually it is some sort of growth in a perception, understanding of the way things are that is closer and closer and more in accordance with reality, rather than all the confusion and wrong views and wrong ideas. So how is this cultivated? Well, first of all, we just begin by receiving instructions and teachings, either by reading or by listening. So that's understanding that comes from what we receive as guidance. Then there is the understandings that arise in us through careful consideration, reflection, understanding the relationship between cause and result, taking a closer look at our views and our biases and the workings of the mind. We integrate some of those spiritual teachings into our own deep appreciation. It resonates with us now. But it's still theory. It's still just in the mind thinking. It's not realizing. And the highest wisdom, that bhavana is mental cultivation. And it's a term really, that's the cultivating of the mind's ability to perceive directly, direct experience of reality, direct insight, which is the highest wisdom. And so, Bodhisattva or a spiritual person would endeavor to cultivate this wisdom. Virya, it's got a lot of different meanings: energy, diligence, effort, and of course, it is also a critical part of the Buddhist path, and the Buddha taught it in many ways, on many occasions, how to put forth effort. And basically, in the Eightfold Path, he talks about the 4 aspects of right effort, which means applying energy, applying effort to prevent unwholesome qualities, the negative states of mind from arising, if they have arisen, to try and overcome, to try and get beyond. The effort to cultivate wholesome qualities, these virtues, and the effort to strengthen those wholesome qualities. So again, it's, on a spiritual path, there has to be some intention and there has to be some effort. It doesn't really, of course, it's not willpower, it is effort that's always guided by wisdom. Enduring. Sometimes it gets a little bit tough. Sometimes it's hard to be good. Sometimes it's hard to be honest and truthful. Sometimes it's hard to give up things. So this is appreciating that if we are to make any progress on most things in life, but certainly in the spiritual path, it does require some endurance, the ability to maintain the effort, to apply ourselves through the easy times and the hard times. And this is, there are many stories of this. If you have any of the teachings from the forest monks of Thailand, this is one of their big selling points: endurance. Kanti paramang tapo titika. Patient endurance is the highest austerity for the burning up of defilements. So endurance is the highest austerity that you can undertake for the burning up of your defilements. Sounds pretty tough, but a little bit of patient endurance is necessary if we are to keep on the path. Satya, perfection of truthfulness. It's right. The Buddhist, I like a lot of the teachings of the Buddha with regards right speech, and I really think it's so critical and so fundamental to not only a spiritual path and spiritual practice, I just think for the sanity of the world and for the sanity of humanity, for any possibility of harmony and relationship with each other and the world, others in the world. I think speech is just so fundamental and it's so easily misused. So the Buddha, simple, abstaining from lying, abstaining from divisive speech, abstaining from abusive speech, abstaining from idle chatter. It's just pretty, that should be easy. How many of us chatter? Idle chatter is a bit of a problem, but most of us should be able to maintain that. But what I'd like next is the Buddha further refined it and he's saying we're going to speak the truth, good, but this is how we should speak. To speak the truth is good, but this is how we should speak. A statement endowed with 5 factors is well spoken. It is spoken at the right time. It is spoken in truth. It is spoken affectionately. It is spoken beneficially for the benefit. And it is spoken with a mind of goodwill. Now, just think how wonderful life would be, how wonderful America would be, how wonderful everybody, if human beings could do this. But we can train. And a Bodhisatta or one on the spiritual path undertakes that. Adhitthana is resolution. It's another one of these sticking to the commitment, like Kanti, endurance, virya, making effort. Adhitthana is being resolute, sticking to the goal, not being easily dissuaded by the vagrancies and ups and downs of the path, being steadfast to the spiritual path. And even when we're faced with a lot of obstacles, be they internal or external. Metta, loving kindness. I don't know why the Buddha only picked on metta. Well, no, the Buddha did not pick this. Whoever compiled this list, they chose metta instead of karuna, which is compassion. Even in the 6 paramitas of the Mahāyāna tradition, they don't include karuna. And the whole thing is about compassion for others, but it's not included. Metta is one of the 4 divine abodes or emotions, altruistic attitudes of the Buddha. Its loving kindness is a benevolent attitude of goodwill, universal love, heartfelt concern for the well-being of all living beings. It is one of the 4 sublime states. The other ones are compassion, sympathetic joy, and upekkha. And it's, the Buddha over and over emphasized the benefit of cultivating loving kindness for oneself and others. So they included in this list. And the last one of the 10 is upekkha, which is another one of those 4 qualities. And it's interesting that it's put at the end here. The practice of upekkha is the unwavering, or to stay neutral in the face of the 8 vicissitudes of life, which are otherwise known as the 8 directions of worldly winds or the 8 worldly conditions, which everybody's exposed to. Wherever you go, whatever position you have in life, you're going to encounter loss and gain, good repute and ill repute, praise and censure, sorrow and happiness, always a duality because it's samsara. Samsara is always a duality. If there's one, there'll be the opposite. Upekkha means that ability to stay equanimous in the face of whether it's praise or blame, good or bad, to have some inner resource, inner refuge that allows you to ride the waves of samsara without being swept too far, either one side or the other. Unfortunately, in most spiritual, especially Buddhism, I think one of the criticism of Buddhist teachers and Buddhist monks is that they're too passive, that they want to stand away from the problems of the world. And this is, like equanimity to an extreme. Equanimity, upekkha, is like that's the last resort. There are all those other things you've got to do. You've got to be generous, you've got to be kind, you've got to have effort and do stuff. You do all that you can to better the conditions for yourself and others. And once you've done that, you rest. That's upekkha. So these are the 10 paramitas. I could have done the 6, but I chose the 10. I'm sorry. Now, even cultivating those 10 paramitas, it doesn't say anything about enlightenment. Those 10 paramitas are not even mentioned as far as enlightenment. It was not until the Bodhisatta, after years of ascetic practices, sat under the Bodhi tree, made his mind extremely peaceful through the practice of meditation, and entered those jhana states of concentration that were mentioned in the 6 paramitas, that he had that realization, he had this enlightenment experience. It wasn't because the paramitas were you can say like foundational qualities, but in themselves they are not transcendental. They do not radically change. It is the insight and knowledge. So the Buddha, to be the Bodhisatta, sat under the Bodhi tree, he had done all the work, preparation. He was able to still his mind, enter these very refined states of concentration. And when his mind was thus purified, he was able to have this direct experience, which we call knowledge and vision of things as they really are, or enlightenment. And that realization radically transformed him. It radically transformed by eliminating the delusion, the greed, the hatred that were previously present in his mind. These are often termed as the taints, the defilements, and so it was that experience that led to the arising of the Buddha. Knowledge and vision. I directly knew, as it actually is, this is suffering, this is the origin of suffering, this is the cessation of suffering, this is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. This realization is what made him Buddha. All the rest was preamble. Knowing thus and seeing thus, my heart was liberated from the taint of sensual desire, from the taint of being, that's the desire to be reborn, and from the taint of ignorance. When liberated, there came the knowledge, it is liberated, and I had direct knowledge. Birth is exhausted, the holy life has been lived. What was to be done is done. There is no more of this to come. And he further says, so long as my knowledge and vision of these Four Noble Truths was not thoroughly purified in this way, I did not claim to have awakened to the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment. But when my knowledge and vision of these Four Noble Truths was thoroughly purified in this way, then I claimed to have awakened to this unsurpassed perfect enlightenment. And the knowledge and vision arose in me. Unshakable is the liberation of my mind. This is my last birth. There is no more renewed existence. So that difference between the paramitas and all those virtues, they're very core teachings in Buddhism. But they are not the essential teachings in Buddhism. The essential teachings in Buddhism are the Four Noble Truths. And when the Four Noble Truths are, there is suffering, this suffering is to be understood, comprehended clearly. And the Buddha said, and I have comprehended and understood this. There is the cause of suffering. This cause must be abandoned. I have abandoned it. There is the end of suffering. This must be realized. I have realized it. There is the path leading to the end of suffering. This path must be cultivated. I have cultivated it. And that's why he was able to say that he claimed to be fully enlightened. So, as far as I can see, whether it's a bodhisatta or a bodhisattva, they're both committed to a spiritual life for the benefit of others and oneself. If they really want to be a Buddha, it's a slightly longer path. But no Buddha saves all living beings, because we've had lots of Buddhas. No Buddha saves all living beings, unless you understand that in a very, if you're saved, everybody's saved. I don't know, but it doesn't, it's not according to the Buddhist tradition. And within the Theravāda tradition, the difference, say, the Buddha is fully enlightened. he is special in many ways. He has many attributes that many of the other enlightened disciples did not have. But they were all equal. All the enlightened disciples and the Buddha were all arahants in that they had this clear, penetrating realization that completely eradicated greed, hatred, and delusion and ended the realm of rebirth for them. So they're equal as far as that. But the Buddha, because of his commitment to the longer training, if you wish, did have a lot of special qualities. And one of them was the ability to teach in such a way that he would inspire great followers, great followings. And that's why we still have these teachings today, because of those who were inspired either directly by the Buddha, by his disciples, by his teachings, and currently the present-day teachings.